Good evening, everyone. We are the ITESO team, and we're here to present our analysis and recommendation on a proudly Mexican company called Cemex. Being inside the World Top 3 ranking is a great challenge, and let me tell you, Cemex has done this before. This is what we know it has the potential to reach this rank again. Things shifted the opposite a few years back. Nevertheless, the courage and determination of this company has demonstrated an impressive recovery, and we are certain that they will reach the top players once again.
We support our recommendation within a 12-month target price of 19 pesos and 22 cents, representing a 31% upside from its December 29th closing price. We reassure our position as we strongly believe in the company's strategy and determination of being the best. Our valuation is backed up with 3 valuation techniques and 2 Monte Carlo simulations, one for the overall target price and one for the leverage ratio.
Cemex is a global building materials company dedicated to the production and distribution of cement, ready-mix concrete, and other aggregates. Cemex is present in more than 50 communities around the world, primarily in Mexico, USA, and Europe. Now, it is important to mention that cement is a capital-intensive industry, where only a few competitors control the market in many countries. Cemex is the most important cement company in Mexico, giving them power to control the market and benefit from pricing strategies.
To put things a little bit more context, we're going to mention some key facts. Cemex's business model has been changing over the years. Back in 2007, they were really well known in the industry for the expansion via acquisition of companies through that. The perfect storm came when they decided to buy Rinker, the biggest transaction ever. And just 1 year later, the world crisis came along. The projected result was to position Cemex as the #1 materials company in the world and repay its debt within just 2 years of the free cash flow generated of this new company. The actual result was completely the opposite, leaving Cemex with almost an unpayable debt.
Cemex has managed to reduce its leverage ratio from 7.4 times in 2010 to 3.98 times in 2017. Now, the target, which has been Cemex's primary strategy driver, is to diminish its leverage ratio to 3 times. The company expects to reach this target by the first quarter of 2019. The team performed a profound analysis on this matter, as it caught our attention that the leverage ratio meant so much for the company. After doing this, we realized that this was a complex model. First, we analyzed the variables separately: CapEx, revenue growth, market diversification, and investment grade. We came to the conclusion that all of these variables are linked between each other.
Cemex has covenants due to the refinance of debt back in 2009. This limits its capital expenditures, which means expansion is limited at this time. Cemex has optimized its CapEx by investing in attractive markets, primarily developing economies. This has allowed Cemex to have higher revenues and higher margins, which consequently means more free cash flow to repay more debt. As this tendency keeps on going, the leverage ratio goes down, and the plan is to reach the 3 times target by the first quarter of 2019. When this is accomplished, they will now be in a position to acquire the so desired investment grade.
When this is achieved, the strategy will shift to expansion. As cost of debt goes down, other sectors can now invest in the company, covenants diminish, and Cemex can now invest and expand. To observe the probability of this to happen, we perform a Monte Carlo simulation to the leverage ratio, which showed 70% probability to reach its target by 2019, which will consequently have a positive effect in all the key points mentioned before. If this happens sooner than expected, we will have a 7% additional upside from our original target price of 19 pesos and 22 cents.
Now, it is important to mention certain facts about the industry and Cemex's competitive position. Cemex's revenue growth has been above the industry average for the past few years, having a year-over-year average growth of 9.7% compared to the industry average of 7.4%. Another important point to mention is the EBITDA margin. Cemex has managed to improve its margins from 15% in 2011 to 20% in 2016. Also, Cemex has shown higher margins than its competitors, having an 18% margin average compared to the industry average of 16%.
CEMEX return over invested capital has increased from 3.88% in 2012 to 9.3% in 2017 and expected to be at 11.81% in 2018. This mainly due to the bigger margins and the cost reduction strategy. The forecasted EVA tendency for the next 5 years is expected to be at 2.74%, which in a worst-case scenario of a constant WACC. As we expect, cost of debt will go down in 2019, meaning that the value will increase, meaning that the company is generating more value for invested resources. Cost reduction has been a crucial activity for the company. They managed to cut $150 million annually since 2011, mainly due to the optimization of assets, inventory reduction to prevent accumulation, the use of alternative fuels, and removing redundancies.
Our overall valuation model is backed up with 3 valuation approaches: discounted cash flows, adjusted present value, and multiples, weighted 50, 25, and 25% respectively.
For the DCF valuation, we use the free cash flow to firm technique because of the continuous changes of the company's capital structure. It was weighted 50% because it's one of the most accurate methods as it requires the complete comprehension and forecast of the whole business model. We calculated a 2.11 perpetual growth rate and a 10.86 WACC rate to discount the cash flows. The result was in 18 Mexican pesos and 28 cents share price.
Adjusted present value approach was weighted 25%, as it is a technique used for companies targeting a financial structure, assuming it is all equity financed. As we mentioned before, CEMEX is targeting to lower its leverage ratio. With this valuation, we arrived to 19 pesos and 41 cents price.
The multiples approach was weighted 25%. This adds value to our 2 previous valuations as it accounts for what's happening in the industry. The ratios used were total enterprise value divided by revenues, EBITDA, and EBIT, as the comparable company's structure varies from one another. The final price for this valuation is 20 Mexican pesos and 90 cents. As we mentioned before, our overall target price is 19 pesos and 22 cents, representing a 31% upside from its closing price of December 29. To complete our analysis, we observed that the main threats are related to the economic and market risks. As we mentioned before, the cement industry is highly correlated to the macroeconomic cycles, meaning that in the event of recession or economic slowdown, CEMEX revenues would naturally decrease. This risk could be mitigated by having a diversified portfolio, where the probability of a certain economic event happening in more than one country is extremely low.
On the other hand, it is also important to consider the changes in energy prices. 25% of CEMEX production costs are related to electricity, fuel, and gas. This is a potential threat to the company, as the changes in energy prices could damage the company's margins. CEMEX, as a leading and innovative company, adopts alternative fuels, which in 2016 accounted for 23% of the total consumption, and they target a 35% by 2020. Alternative fuels not only reduce the ecological footprint, but they also reduce the exposure against rising prices.
In order to complete our risk analysis, we stress our model in a second Monte Carlo simulation for the overall target price, which resulted in an 82% probability to have a buy rating, for which 26% out of this area is a strong buy. On the other hand, only an 18% probability to downgrade our judgment to hold.
To conclude our recommendation, the team positioned CEMEX as a conviction trade, mainly due to its strategic business allocation, optimization of financial structure, and a positive economic value added. Also, thanks to the magnificent job of the management team. Thank you so much for listening to us tonight, and let's help CEMEX keep building the future. Thank you.
The floor is open for questions now.
Could you talk something about, well, congratulations for the presentation.
Thank you.
Could you talk about the perpetual growth rate? How do you get 2%?
Of course. Thank you for asking. Let us put the supply material for answering that question. Thank you.
Well, for the perpetual growth rate, we consider it appropriate to consider the 10-year forecast GDP growth for the main countries where CEMEX operates. In this case, it was the US, which has a 26 share, revenue share. Mexico has 20% revenue share. Europe has 23%, and Latin America and the Caribbean 12%. What we did was to take the expected growth for the next 10 years, the GDP growth, and then we just did a weighted average with these values.
Good job. I have one question. You have a buy recommendation, and you presented a very good analysis that supports the buy recommendation and a very bullish speech. But what can go wrong? On the risk side, you mentioned economic and market risk. Yeah, I agree, but this applies for all the other companies that are listed in the Mexican exchange and in other exchanges. So can you be a bit more specific and mention the two main risks, external and internal? Internal meaning that is in the risk that is in hands of CEMEX, what can go wrong, and on the external side, but not too generic as you mentioned before, please.
Sure. Well, CEMEX is in the cement industry area. So what my friend here, Vega, said was that energetics is a big part of the total cost of producing cement. So the rising prices of energy, fuel, has a direct impact on CEMEX cost, which would consequently mean lower margins. The way CEMEX mitigates this risk is by using alternative fuels, which is important to mention that is a leading company in the whole industry to do this. It targets the 30% use of alternative fuels by 2020, while the comparable company's average is about 8%. So that's one thing. Then another thing is that the interest rates and the exchange fluctuation. 70% of CEMEX debt is in US dollars. We did a comparison to mitigate this risk of the revenues that are in US dollars. CEMEX has an income in US dollars of $3 million in the English, or 3,000 million in the Spanish translation. And the total debt is 6,000 million or $6 billion. This means it has 55% of a natural hedge for this matter. I don't know if that answered your question. Or?
In a political year that some volatility is expected, do you think that, would you recommend them to do some hedging strategies?
Sure. We discovered that CEMEX had no exchange rate coverage until 2007, which positions that in a strong threat for the company. But in 2007, they adopted the strategy of acquiring coverage, so that risk could be mitigated that way. Also, it is expected by the President Donald Trump's tax reform to help CEMEX have benefits on tax matters, so that would mitigate that risk in a certain way as well.
Okay. Good answer. Thank you.
Thank you.
One question. Why did you use, to calculate the WACC of the company, the Mexican interest rates instead of US, given that large portion of the debt is in hard currency rather than in Mexican pesos? And if you had used US rates, how would your valuation would have changed?
Well, for the second question, if we would have used exchange rates from US or Europe, our valuation would have had a lower WACC, or at least a lower cost of debt, which would have represented an upside on our price. As we know, a lower WACC means that the cash flows are discounted at a lower rate. For the first question, we decided to use the Mexican risk-free rate because CEMEX presents its revenues in Mexican pesos, and also because our cost of equity analysis is calculated with the Mexican index, stock market index.
Well, at this point, I will try to move from selling us the company to selling us your recommendation. A 30% return in 1 year, considering the recent history of CEMEX, it seems to be a very high number. So, how sensitive is this number for the risk factors that you have already talked? For example, the constant WACC means that you are expecting that the credit spread of the company will be compensated by the higher level of interest rates. Is this an issue since we are talking about a highly leveraged company? What could be wrong about your number?
Okay, well, we performed 2 Monte Carlo simulations to mitigate all those kind of risks, because at first we also thought that 31% was a little bit high. So in this case, the first Monte Carlo simulation that we performed was for the target price, which we simulated different variables from sales to costs to everything that could affect the company, including all those risks that we also already told you. In our target price, we did not consider that they acquire investment grade yet, so that the WACC will be lower. In this case, we remained a little bit conservative. That's also why we have 3 valuation techniques, and we weighted 50% the DCF valuation approach, because it was the lowest number, so we wanted to keep it conservative. Also, when we did the Monte Carlo, we performed like 100 times, because we thought it was like a little bit high, but in every single way we did this, we never had a sell judgment. We just had a buy recommendation or a strong buy and just an 18% of hold. We also performed this one, the Monte Carlo, for the leverage ratio, which and where we considered the risks that the company do not reduce the debt like they've been doing it in the past, and it also has a really good possibility of having a 70% probability to reach the target when they're expecting it. And in that case, if things happen and I don't know, and if they reach investment grade before than expected, we are adding a 7% additional upside from original target price. So we do not think that 31% is high. We actually, with all our fundamental analysis we did, we think it's a really reasonable price that we're setting. I don't know if that answers your question.
Okay, yes, but I want to go deeper on that. Considering that this is like an out of consensus price percentage change expected for 12 months, are we missing something on the Monte Carlo simulation analysis? For example, what about the exchange rate? What about the level of the interest rates? Something that is not on the sales or EBITDA numbers of the company, but that would affect that inputs for your Monte Carlo analysis.
Well, considering the the interest rates that you mentioned before, if we consider them in our Monte Carlo simulation, they were considered for the WACC simulation. We stressed the WACC variable, and even when we had a 3 percentage points below the WACC we are presenting here, our recommendation was the lowest recommendation we could have by doing this simulation was a hold recommendation.
Also, to complement a little bit this on this matter, for example, you could say the S&P stock exchange going down, it affected CEMEX as it. Sorry.